It's so important for people to like understand that bad habits are implicit strategies that they're implicit, they're over practiced. So now they just automatically happen. But automaticity is a result of practice. Now, if pleasure is involved, that is very reinforcing. And so it might have been that it took just one or two times of a certain series of steps for that pattern to be so now reinforced that now it's actually implicit already. Doesn't matter though. If you want to change anything like that, wherever there's automaticity, you now need to have a series of steps laid out.
Before we get started, if you enjoy these episodes, you might want to check out more at OptimalWork.com. Our website offers unique content, tools, and exercises to help you thrive at work and beyond. We have an in-depth masterclass covering our entire theory of growth, daily recommendations for personalized advice, and a platform to help groups and organizations learn and practice optimal work together. You can get a free trial at OptimalWork.com. Now let's start the episode. Hey, this is Sharif here with another episode of the Optimal Work podcast, joined by Dr. Kevin Majeres. Kevin, good to be here with you again.
Hey, Sharif, it's great to be back.
Yeah. Well, Kevin, I just wanted to follow up on our last conversation in our last episode where we talked about mastery. So it was great, and it's great to see that being put at the kind of forefront of our discussion of optimal work. And I thought we kind of isolated into three separate stages of mastery: the explicit phase, the implicit phase, and then the optimizing phase. And I thought this time maybe we could dive a little bit into the explicit phase, if you're okay with that.
Sounds great.
Wonderful. Well, actually, okay, before we even go into that, I want to ask more of a high-level question, which is that, so understanding, the phase of a person's growth, and maybe you could think of someone who, I don't know, comes to optimal work or comes to you professionally, and maybe they have anxiety or ADHD or one of these kind of, I don't know, you call it, psychological problems or something. And well, you say it's not a disorder, and that view actually makes it a disorder. But
I know you're avoiding using the word. Exactly.
I didn't want to use it.
Yes.
So, and just understanding how that relates to mastery, because maybe I would think that, okay, first you help them to overcome anxiety or to overcome ADHD and then, you work a little bit more with them, and then they can start thinking about developing mastery. So I'm wondering if that's how you see it, as these are two separate phases, or they somehow overlap, or they're related. So I don't know if you just talk about the relationship between those two elements.
So just going back to our definition of mastery, it's when the steps of a task have become implicit and optimized. Really, it just means that you now have a habit in place that allows you to thrive. And any time you're engaging in a challenge, whether it's a challenge coming from inside, like distractibility or even anxiety, or it's a challenge coming from outside, there's something that's overwhelming you right now, something that's leaving you with dread. That is the topic for mastery. So in Optimal Work, we help people to master challenges, and particularly to use those challenges to grow in more meaningful ways. But a more meaningful way of growing is just a higher level of mastery. And so at the one hand, you have mastery as as being about skills. And that's just the kind of granular level of like the know-how of how to do particular actions until that doing is very fluid and second nature. And then you also have the ability to master yourself. So instead of mastering something outside of you, it's actually you that you're mastering. And every ideal is a form of mastery in that sense. It's self-mastery. And then you can also think of mastering something between you and someone else, and that's a bond, the bonds you have with others. And bonds themselves are a kind of relational mastery, because this is how you know exactly how to read the other and how to forget about yourself, how to give yourself generously in the setting of that bond. So I think of mastery as being anything that you are improving over time, so that improvement becomes second nature and then is continually improved from there so that you can always grow more in that kind of mastery. That's a beautiful thing about every form of mastery is it's inexhaustible. There's always some way you can raise it. You can get it to be, there's always some way of elevating it.
Hmm. So then, in terms of developing mastery in a particular area, I guess, professionally or
Hmm.
with related to your work, that to work well requires both technical mastery and self-mastery. I mean, it's
Yeah.
right. If you say I'm writing a computer program, I need to know the programming language, but then I also need the self-mastery to be able to, for instance, resist distractions when they come up or
Yeah, and you also need the relational. Yeah, you need the relational mastery to know what is the other person who's having you do this, what do they most need? So that there's always the three levels at work.
okay. So then you're not thinking of isolating one level and developing that one on its own. You're always thinking of how am I developing all three levels all at the same time.
Always.
Yeah.
I think it's inhuman to do otherwise. So I wouldn't, would we want to just help people? Like say you're a piano teacher. You wouldn't want the piano teacher to only be focused on technical excellence. You'd also want them to be like understanding and encouraging and to help the people that they're working with to be more understanding and encouraging. Wouldn't you want them to like help people that the piano teacher is actually teaching a way of being that's relational, that is filled with ideals, that's inspiring, beyond the mere technical expertise. So I think it's inhuman to reduce any kind of interaction to purely technical skills. That there's always self-mastery, there's always the development of bonds. Otherwise, it would have really no value or meaning. Certainly no lasting value.
Okay, that's a profound point, I think. Okay, so now that we have the big picture, better defined here, maybe we could dive into this explicit phase, which is the first phase of mastery that we've identified. So this is
Mhm.
where you're approaching some new task, and I think maybe it can sound kind of easy, come up with a series of steps, but
Mhm.
a lot of times that can be very difficult for people to approaching a new task for the first time, and they have to come up with new steps. So
Yep.
how does one go about doing that, crafting the steps? And then how do you, also I think important is, how do you get the confidence that, okay, these steps are actually going to take me where I need to go so that you actually
Yeah.
have the confidence to now do them?
Only experience actually gives you access to the necessary feedback to know how did this go? Because you can never perfectly predict the outcome of whatever you're trying to do. But you do get better and better uh, at crafting the steps, making those steps more second nature, and then optimizing based on feedback. And those are the three stages. And that applies to, again, any form of mastery that you're trying to develop. Uh, One example I always like to go to is Nicholas Boothman has a book on how to make people like you in 90 seconds. And what he does is he takes the first 90 seconds of any interaction you're going to have with a person you don't know, and then he teaches you what are the little micro steps. That first you make eye contact, then you smile, then you stretch out your hand to shake their hand, and you aim directly at the person's heart when you're doing that. So he has this way of helping people to think granularly. Now, these are all things that ideally are just second nature at some point. And then you learn to optimize them based on how the settings and the kinds of people you're trying to introduce yourself to. If it's a cashier in a store, it might just be the first two, eye contact and smile. Uh, but the idea is that people can learn to like even like interpersonal skills. Those are just steps that can be made explicit, and then they can be practiced again and again until they're implicit, and then they can be continually optimized.
And we don't want to be continually reinventing the wheel, right? I mean,
Exactly.
It could have taken me 10 years to figure out that, wait, I'm supposed to, reach my hand out to the person's heart. I mean, how was
I
I
know,
supposed to
dude.
know that?
Yeah.
So when you say come up with the steps, that's not like a total trivial thing that a person is just supposed to be able to intuit the right steps for every new thing that they're doing. So there's some
Exactly.
element here of learning from other people.
Yeah, and in the way it's described psychologically is that there are two main skills that you use to come up with those steps. The first skill is called modeling, which is you study the strategies of others. You try to understand what makes those strategies work. So, say well, I'll just say then the second one is called metacognition, which is the ability to reflect back and think about what you know, to make it explicit to yourself. And so you could be then like in the first phase, the modeling, you're kind of shopping around. You're looking for strategies that other people use. Is this a kind of thing that people have written books about? Are there YouTube videos that talk about this, how people do it? Could you ask AI for what are the strategies that people use to do X? Talk to people that you know. If there's someone you know that's really good at X, then ask them how they think about doing it. So there's a kind of shopping phase to like be looking around and willing to learn from others the strategies they use to do the things that you do, that you would like to do better. And then the metacognition is you reflect again, you try to see, can you make explicit now the steps you would like to go through? But that's reflecting more on what you know. And this actually are the two steps of prudence, the first two steps of prudence, according to Thomas Aquinas, that the first act of prudence is to seek counsel from others to learn their strategies. And then the second is to reflect on what you know. So you're able to, to make it explicit to yourself. And that is always, I think people need to be doing those two things.
Before we continue, a brief message. If you're benefiting from these discussions, please take a moment to hit like and subscribe. Doing so helps us to reach more people. So you're not just learning, you're also helping others to discover a path of growth and flourishing. Thanks for your support.
So when you shop around for strategies now, you might have a couple different ways of doing it. And then reflecting on what you know is kind of saying, okay, this, now I'm applying it to my specific situation. So maybe this strategy looks the best, but I like this step from this strategy. So you're kind of fitting it now before you've actually done anything in the area, before you've taken the action. You're just working the strategies based on what you know.
Exactly. When the way you evaluate other people's strategies is you try to have a sense of what were they aiming to attain. And that makes a huge difference, right? And sometimes they're trying to teach you that, say, if you're going to do the forehand in tennis, well, these are the ordinary steps that people do. And then you could practice those bit by bit and put them together into one swing. But there are various ways of doing the forehand that you could shape in different ways. You have to understand what's the intention of them, like what's the goal. Or say with anxiety, that sometimes people use distraction as a strategy, and they teach other people distraction techniques. Or they use breath work as a strategy. That's a really tricky one because 80% or more of people who teach breath work for anxiety are doing it with the either implicit or explicit intention of trying to lower anxiety levels, trying to lower adrenaline, right? So that's going to be a particular goal with the steps they try to teach people to use to attain it. And then the best strategy, of course, for people who have listened to us before, is that you try to help people utilize the adrenaline for meaningful growth in the moment, which means set a positive growth goal for yourself within the challenge. Aim for that. Practice welcoming and reframing the adrenaline itself. Learn to use mindfulness to open up to the anxiety feeling instead of trying to make it go down. So I think that's actually the foolproof strategy. It will always work. And so people then can evaluate strategies based on, okay, is it just trying to distract me? Is it trying to control adrenaline? Or is it trying to utilize it? Those are different goals and they have different steps. So you can be much more wise when you're looking at other people's strategies if you can be discerning what is the stated or unstated goal in this strategy.
hmm Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, if you're starting, say, a fitness program, you don't just say, "Oh, what's the best fitness program?" But obviously, each one is going to be tailored toward different goals, as an example.
Exactly. And so like very commonly it'd be like endurance versus strength.
hmm
And then it's gonna be different, even though it might be similar at some level, like say how to do a kettlebell workout. Well, there are kettlebell workouts that will be more designed for endurance and those more designed for strength building. So you have to know what's the goal behind it.
Uh, how do you weigh the importance of understanding? I guess so. You have the goal, and then you have the steps, and that together is the strategy.
Yeah.
But also just that why it works. How important is that to understand the at a deeper level, like the principles underlying that strategy and why it works, to give you the confidence that it will work also for you?
Well, the first stage of growing in mastery, the explicit stage, is where all of that kind of knowledge comes in. So your knowledge of cause and effect, your knowledge of how the brain works, all of that is incredibly important. So reading books that explain cause and effect. So if you're, say, trying to master cravings, right, then if you were to read a really good neuroscience book, it would be teaching you so many things about cause and effect. All of that should then go in to making explicit strategies. So it's not just you're learning about strategies from others, you're also learning about how things work and why they work.
Okay, so that's important too. And yeah, maybe that's the next thing to get into is getting the confidence that that this strategy will actually work for me. And I think we had talked about crafting a series of steps, and maybe you could just clarify, like, when is there going to be an ordered series of steps versus in some cases, like, at a meeting, okay, there might be a series of steps in the sense of the meeting having an agenda, but also as a participant in the meeting, you might be more thinking, how to have a good productive meeting these are the skills I want to work on, like active listening or effective contributions or things like that, where it's less about a series of steps and more about sub skills that you want to be developing. So I don't know if you could talk about that distinction a little bit.
Yeah, two thoughts. One is that often people will think that that the work they're doing does not allow for a series of steps. They'll think that somehow this is a creative work, right? And so they just need, but if you think about it, say you're writing an essay, well, that's creative work. But there is also a very clear series of steps in terms of you need to have a defined thesis. You need to then have supporting arguments. You need to have introduction, conclusion. So there are all these things that in fact are steps. So if people think that their work does not allow for steps, maybe they should be skeptical about that. And maybe if they're just skipping this kind of first process, which is making explicit the steps, and they're kind of hoping that implicit steps will carry them through. And so really they have a normal way of doing it. So if you were to ask someone struggling with an addiction, so is the addiction itself the lack of steps? Oh, not at all. The steps they go through to do the addiction are very precise and ordered. And they're always the same. They're so well practiced that now they're implicit, so they seem invisible. So people just feel like they have this kind of tunnel that as soon as there's a particular trigger, then boom, it's like everything just goes down. But in fact, they're going through a series of steps. So it's so important for people to understand that bad habits are implicit strategies that they've been implicit. They're over practiced. So now they just automatically happen. But automaticity is a result of practice. Now, if pleasure is involved, that is very reinforcing. And so it might have been that it took just one or two times of a certain series of steps for that pattern to be so now reinforced that now it's actually implicit already. Doesn't matter though. If you want to change anything like that, wherever there's automaticity, you now need to have a series of steps laid out. The checklist, each item on a checklist is a little micro goal that can powerfully reshape habits. If in the moment, instead of going down your ordinary series of steps, which perhaps goes against your long-term intentions, you can just now deliberately follow out and check off these series. So when people think that their work doesn't allow for steps, sometimes it's that their way of working that kind of task has just become so implicit, they've overlearned whatever strategy they're using. They don't even see it anymore, right? So that I would just say, be skeptical. If there's any element of automaticity, then you do have, in fact, a strategy. It's just now gone invisible. The second real quick point to make is that you can distinguish between different types of work and different kinds of growth goals you set for yourself. Some could be more algorithmic and some are more heuristic. So this is like a classic distinction. But the algorithm is where you can proceed through step 1, through step 2, through step 3, and so on. And I believe that in reality, most work has a component that is, in fact, algorithmic. But you can have a higher order thing. Like, let's say you have a meeting. The agenda for the meeting, that's the algorithm. But then you can have on top of it a higher order, which is called heuristic, which is essentially conditionals, like if A, then B. And you can set a few of those as growth goals in advance. So if you normally roll your eyes whenever Bob says something, well, then when Bob is speaking, that's your kind. What you're going to do now is instead of rolling the eyes, you're going to try to like smile and make eye contact and then take notes thoughtfully on what Bob is saying. Okay, so now what you've done is you have to wait for it to happen. Maybe Bob won't even speak. But if he does, you're not going to roll your eyes this time because you're ready for it. Or you're going to practice active listening, or where if Bob goes on and on, you're going to deliberately let him finish his sentence before you begin your next one. Yeah, and you're going to nod and say, uh-huh, and kind of smile as he's saying it, so he knows you're hearing him. So those are heuristic goals. It's like you have to be looking for the moment to practice them, but even when that moment comes, you still have a little series of steps that you're going to be practicing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So it seems like if there's some kind of unknown here that you're not going to necessarily be able to plan all the steps in advance, like in a meeting, you don't know exactly what's going to happen in the future, or even on so-called, creative work where you're doing something for the first time, you don't know exactly how everything's going to turn out. So that's part of mastery is knowing, if this situation arises, like, oh, it turns out my thesis is totally wrong, then here's how I'm going to respond. So you kind of know the steps that you take in response to specific situations that you wouldn't have necessarily anticipated in advance.
Exactly. So there's always some good that the intellect is able to discern as a goal. And then the intellect can break that down into specific, attainable steps. Ideally, with each step having a little bit of a challenge in it, but attainable. So this is the work of order, right? Order is how you apply intelligence to real challenges. And I think that the beauty of the intellect, right, is that it can always find a way of putting order into a challenge in some way. And if it can't be pure algorithm, then at least there's something there that it, like some heuristic goal, is able to set for itself to be able to be practicing.
Wonderful. Well, Kevin, maybe we could turn at this stage to the idea of these micro goals, which are basically we're talking about the steps that you've set for yourself.
Yeah.
And how do these motivate you, and how can you be confident that they're leading in the right direction? So maybe you could elaborate on the importance of having these steps crafted.
Yes, this is interesting where it gets into the neurobiology of dopamine. And there's a lot to be said for how mastery relates to dopamine, because in a sense, like dopamine is the hidden ingredient at work in every stage of growing in mastery. So, where micro goals come in is if you take a task you're about to do and then break it into a series of steps. Let's say it's a task that you've been putting off a long time, right? And so you're kind of dreading doing it, you're reluctant to engage it. Take whatever task you have in your mind that you're most reluctant to do. And then that is going to be the setting to discover the power of these micro goals. What you need to do then is turn that task into a checklist where you know how to do every item that you'll check off. Okay, what you've done now is you've actually set yourself up to maximize dopamine while doing that task. And so there are 3 things that maximize dopamine release at this stage. The first is simply focusing on one thing at a time. So already that will enhance dopamine release in your brain. So just sequential unitasking, doing one thing at a time, working on only one thing. So multitasking actually drains you of dopamine. There's too many things there. But if you can gather your attention into one, hold it in one, and then now you're just going to do this task, which is now a checklist. That already containing the task sets you for maximal dopamine in the task. And then as you go through the task, the moment you're nearing completion of one of the items, one of the steps, you get another increase in dopamine. That's probably the biggest increase in dopamine. It's as you're about to achieve a goal. And then when you check it off, you get another enhanced release of dopamine. So these are the 3 things then that in any task can give you more dopamine to do just that one thing. And then as you do each step, as you're about to check it off and then check it off, you get more. So dopamine is responsible then for the feeling of momentum you get as you do the task, where it becomes easier and easier and easier to do it. So it already is a kind of shaping of desires. So it's not so hard to shape your desires. A checklist is the most easy, concrete way to begin shaping desires. And as you go through it and you find, in fact, that this task is easier than you had anticipated, maybe more fulfilling, more enjoyable than you anticipated, that prediction error, it's called a positive prediction error, actually gives you yet another dopamine boost. So if it actually works and gives you great results and it was actually much easier, which it will be if you use the checklist, then you get even more dopamine. And that means the next time you do the task, those steps will be even more second nature to you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and you only get that benefit if you're breaking the task down in advance into a series of ordered steps.
Well, let's say you're going to do something for 45 minutes and it has no steps. Well, then what is the likelihood that you'll get distracted along the way? Like, it's much higher, right? Than if you had several steps in it. So that means you're much less likely to do just that one thing within this time period. So already that knocks out the first one. And then the second one is that as you're approaching the completion of the step, you get more dopamine. But if you only have one step, which is the whole 45 minutes, you only get some of that. So it is reduced because it's only one. Instead of like if you had 5 steps, you would have had more of it. And then also the final thing is when you actually check it off as it's done, then you get more dopamine. Well, that more dopamine you get from that completion phase isn't really invested in the task itself. It's going to be outside of the task.
It doesn't keep you moving to the subsequent steps. Yeah,
exactly. So it's not bad to just do, like one thing for 45 minutes, but it takes much more willpower in a sense to be able to do it. So actually having smaller is the easiest thing to experiment. Like instead of cleaning the house for 45 minutes, have a checklist and have just, okay, this is what I'm going to do, 5 to 10 minute steps. And in fact, it's much easier to keep going. So it seemingly needs much less willpower.
Awesome, Kevin. Well, that's all I got for you, and we're basically out of time here. So
Great, Sharif. Well, I guess there's probably more to be said about how mastery shapes desires. So maybe we'll talk more about that next time.
yeah, are you thinking that for is that like phase 2 of the implicit mastery, phase
Yeah.
3 of
The
optimizing mastery,
optimizing.
or kind of optimizing? Okay, so we'll cover that in more detail. Great.
Yeah, we'll go into more, especially the implicit. We'll take a special deep dive into that next time.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, all right. Thanks a lot, Kevin.
Great, thank you, Sharif.
We'll be back.
Thanks for tuning in to today's episode. If you enjoyed our conversation and you're looking for more in-depth guidance, check out OptimalWork.com, our unique platform that delivers content, tools, and exercises to help you thrive at work and beyond.